So one last thing about constructors that I have to pontificate about. Not something we need that often, but as our classes get larger and larger, it is something we ought to use occasionally. What I have is the same example we've been working with for a while, which by now I am using this member construction syntax. So when I run my rectangle constructor and I want to construct my members lower left and upper right, I can provide constructor arguments here in this list of initializers after the constructor's signature, but before its code begins. And then I have the actual code for the constructor. But I've observed that, there's a bit of duplication here, and it's not that bad, but maybe if I write classes with lots of constructors, this could get pretty onerous. There could be lots of constructors with a lot of the same code inside of them. So what do I do? And I think in this particular case, I would argue that the most general constructor is this one. The one that takes all four coordinates. So the x and y coordinates of the lower left corner, the x and y coordinates of the upper right corner. This constructor is sort of a special case of this one. It's where the special case where the lower left is at the position 0, 0. And the private constructor is the case where both corners are 0. What I'm wondering is there a way I could collapse all three of these down into one case? And the answer is basically yes. What I'm allowed to do is I can delete code. I'll just get rid of this. I can clean up my constructors a bit. I am allowed in one constructor to defer the construction to a different constructor for the same class. So here what I'm doing is constructing both of my members. What I'm allowed to do instead is defer. Notice how I'm using the name rectangle. I'm deferring to a different rectangle constructor. We call this constructor delegation. So I'm saying call the constructor for rectangle and give it these four parameters, 0, 0, 0, 0. Of course, an object only gets constructed once. Once it's been constructed, you can't construct it again. But with this feature, you are allowed to have one constructor follow on another constructor. What this is really saying is when I call the default constructor, first call this constructor, and when it's over, run whatever code's in here. And I'm going to do the same thing with this one. So I've gotten rid of the error check. That's going to be done up here. What I'll do is when you give me just a width and height, I will delegate that to the other rectangle constructor. I'm going to put this on the same line. I'm going to delegate that to the constructor above it. So I'm going to call it with the lower left point is going to be 0, 0, and the upper right point will be the width and height as before. So this code says when I call this constructor, first run this constructor and do all the construction that it entails. And then if there is any code inside this one, it does still get run, but it gets run as you'd expect after the delegation is done. So after we've run the delegated constructor. So we'll try that out. The reason why we need this is we do occasionally find ourselves writing a whole bunch of different, very, very similar constructors that are special cases of each other. So if you do this, you could write one general one and have all the other ones defer to that one. There we go. And what we'll notice is the interesting construct here, which is whenever I call, so down here I've gone back to the original example where both of my two constructor calls use the width and height constructor, the one that takes two arguments. And so we'll go and take a look at that again. Notice how when I do my construction in main, first I call the bounding box constructor because when I try and call the width and height constructor, it delegates to the bounding box constructor. And then when the bounding box constructor is over, I run the code inside the width and height constructor. And so I'm not constructing the object twice. I'm just specifying this constructor's construction sequence begins by running this other constructor and then finishes off by running the code in here. You'll often see when you have constructor delegation being used that often there is nothing actually in the constructors that do the delegation. They just say defer everything, just hoist it right over to this one, and then that's all the work that needs to be done. But you do have the option of putting code in every constructor, even constructors that defer some of their work to a different constructor of the same class. And of course, I think it goes without saying, you can only do the delegation inside a constructor call. Nowhere else in the class or outside the class are you allowed to attempt to call a constructor out of nowhere. The only times a constructor ever gets run is when the object is being created, and that is during the construction sequence. So it is true that a constructor can defer to a different constructor, but there's no other context where it makes any sense to suddenly call a constructor out of nowhere.